less. The government respond by wondering how on earth taxpayer-funded programmes directed at the poor can have made life worse for them, and foreseeing a return to Thatcherism. Before we discuss, Paul Mason reports.
For every tube station along the Jubilee line, from Westminster to the East End, Londoners living in those areas lose almost an entire year of expected life.
One thing is clear. Poverty has persisted throughout the longest economic boom we've ever had and the longest Labour government. Inequality got worse. It's put the Conservatives on a roll on an issue that Labour regarded as its own.
The era of big government has run its course. Poverty and inequality have got worse despite Labour's massive expansion of the state. We need new answers now, and they will only come from a bigger society, not a bigger government. And that is why
Cameron's message to an audience of Guardian readers was that top-down anti-poverty strategy has failed. Small-scale activism must take the strain.
So through decentralisation, transparency and accountability, we can give people power over the services they use, over the way their tax money is spent, over how their local area is run. But the state, we believe, must go further than just enabling these opportunities. It must actively help people to take advantage of them.
That's the theory. Here's the practice. London Citizens, an alliance of 150 churches and community groups, campaigns on low pay, street crime, predatory lending and migrant rights. Angus Ritchie coordinates its work with Anglican churches.
I think there's a real issue about whether poor people are engaged with seriously as possible agents of change. They're not simply passive victims. They're people who have the capacity, when they're listened to, when they're allowed through the work of London Citizens and other organisations like us, to take the initiative. If the poor are actually listened to, if their power is recognised, that's when real change is possible.
And what is it they say when you listen to them?
What people involved in London Citizens are saying is they're saying we want a living wage, we want affordable housing, we want an Olympics that actually leaves a legacy that benefits this area and isn't just imposed on it. They're saying we want an amnesty for undocumented migrant workers.
What's the challenge for David Cameron?
Is he going to take organised people in churches, mosques, temples, schools seriously? Is he going to listen to what they have to say about a living wage, about affordable housing, about migrant workers?
About, in other words, some of the things that he might not agree with you about?
Absolutely. Is this actually about recognising the voice of civil society and listening to what it asks for? Or is it simply about expecting civil society to become some kind of service provider in the place of the state?
If you measure poverty as when a family has to survive on 60% of the average income, then 13.5 million people in the UK are poor, 23% of the population. If you trace this over the last two governments, the trends are obvious. Poverty rocketed in the first years of the Thatcher government and remained close to 24% of the population throughout the 1990s. Labour reversed the trend on this and many other measures, but after 2004 it's crept back up. And if you look at the very poor, under 40% of average income, they've stayed constant since the early 90s.
The figures show that whatever it is Labour was doing to combat poverty is no longer having the same effect. In truth, at local level, all parties now place great emphasis on community action and social activism. The problem is, the whole history of a place like this tells us, without the state, it was never enough.
Those who work in poor communities warn it takes years to get social entrepreneurship right. That accountability is a constant problem, and, unlike the state, self-help is fragile.
Well, with us now are the Work and Pensions Secretary, Yvette Cooper, and the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Theresa May. Theresa May, exactly what services will be taken out of the hands of the state and given to voluntary organisations and the like?
Well, a variety of things. I mean, one of the things we want to do, it's not just about working with voluntary organisations, it's also about empowering people. For example, parents having greater say in the running of schools, local communities having a greater say in what is actually happening in the policing of their area. It's about giving that power down to the local level. But it is also about identifying good work that has been done by social entrepreneurs, identifying where that works and franchising that among social entrepreneurs.
What proportion of state services would you imagine being contracted out in some way?
Well, I'm not going to put a figure on it, Jeremy, but if you look at one of...
Well, rough idea. Is it 5%, 20%, 50%?
Let's just look at one of the areas where we know that some social entrepreneurs have been doing a very good job, for example, in terms of how the state, in terms of looking at social entrepreneurs who've been helping people back into unemployment, overcoming the barriers that some people have, particularly young people, to get into unemployment.
You really have no idea what proportion you're aiming at, even?
This isn't a target-driven culture. We have a rather different approach to these things. It's about identifying good practice.
No, empirically, you've looked at these things, and you must have some idea of how much is unnecessarily done by the state.
It's about looking for good practice that is being done by social entrepreneurs and then franchising that around. But it's about other things too.
Okay,
it's about dealing with worklessness through welfare reform. It's about dealing with educational failure.
All right.
Because fundamentally it's about dealing with the causes of poverty.
Yvette Cooper, whether we get the details of this or not, you must accept that since your own policy is demonstrably not working, some new approach is called for.
Well, I think if you look at what's happened, for example, to child poverty, you've seen 500,000 fewer children in poverty
as a result on child poverty.
Hang on a second. Let me answer the question first, Jeremy. We have reduced the number of children in poverty by about 500,000, and if we hadn't done anything, if we hadn't taken any of the action on things like the tax credits or the minimum wage, you'd have had about 2 million more children in poverty.
No one denies if you had done nothing.
Can I just respond to the important point that you asked Teresa
but
about
you're telling the public out there that it's all going terribly well on child poverty. Is it not the case that your target was to halve child poverty by next year, and you are not going to do it?
No, what I'm saying is that we've actually got to do an awful lot more. So I agree with you. We do have to do more. Well, we want to keep working towards the target. The target is for next year, and we want to keep working towards it. And you recognise, I hope, that we have made a lot of progress, but only because we've been prepared to do things that government does, and not say that, in fact, what we should say is that the state should withdraw, that we should leave charities and community groups to pick up the pieces. But Teresa did raise an important... You did ask Teresa an important point.
Let her get back. You've made a very serious accusation about their argument about withdrawing from responsibility. Let her respond to that.
And I think this is one of the crucial points, Jeremy, that what we're not saying is that there is no role for the state, but we're saying that the state has a different role in the future to the one that it's had over the last decade. We don't believe the state should be a big interfering state. We think the state does have a role in encouraging people, in encouraging community action and empowering people.
This is purely rhetorical.
No,
you can't give us a figure. You can't give us even a rough figure. You can't give us a guesstimate even.
I can tell you how many services that we contract with the voluntary sector at the moment from my department, the kinds of things to help people back into employment. We have over 250 providers at the moment. Of those, about a third are currently the public sector, a third are the private sector, and a third are voluntary sector. So we actually think it is a good thing to involve the voluntary sector, to involve the third sector non-for-profit organisations in helping people back to work. But it's not an alternative to putting in government investment, £5 billion of extra government investment helping people back into jobs that Teresa and her party have repeatedly opposed, and the things that they are saying about cutting support for the economy. You've got respected economists saying that would push unemployment up to 5 million. That would be devastating for poverty, devastating for inequality as well.
I think there is a real debate to be had about the role of the state versus the role of the private sector and the voluntary and social entrepreneurs. And that's why I'm so disappointed in the government's response that we've seen today, which has very much been it's an either-or. Either you have the charities or voluntary sector working, or you have big government. I think one of the problems with the interference from big government we've seen over the last decade is it has gradually been sucking out individual responsibility from people and communities. And we need to reinvigorating that.
David Cameron said today it was getting rid of kindness and, you know, human generosity and creativity. I mean, that seemed to me to be a bit of a mad ideological rant against the public sector. You know, it's like
there's never going to be anything good happening. You're talking about giving power to communities. Wouldn't the inevitable consequence of giving power to communities mean that rich communities would look after themselves and poor communities would look after themselves as best they could? And isn't it precisely the function of the state to ensure that doesn't happen?
No, it's the function of the state is to be involved where it's right for the state to be involved, but also the function of the state is to encourage people through communities to be able to take control over their own lives. It's about empowering them. And if you look at some of the evidence, if you look, for example, at the work that the Centre for Social Justice and Ian Duncan-Smith has looked at, in many communities up and down the country, it's people actually taking action within their own communities that is having an impact, that is improving the conditions for people living in those areas and in those estates.